There is yet another way some try to explain away their unworkable secular chronology, by desperately appealing to Zechariah. They see the problems with the 537 BC restoration date, so instead they make a different claim, that the 70 years of desolation ended 20 years after Jerusalem became re-inhabited. See the accompanying chart for a comparison with biblical chronology. The claim is based on these two verses of Zechariah, which, when taken out of context, seem to support their idea to an extent. Zechariah 1:12 and Zechariah 7:5. This is an old argument, though, and has been addressed and refuted already many times. Apostate and pagan YouTubers and trolls need to keep up, because they make hasty assumptions about what Zechariah is actually saying and meaning. On first glance, they think they have an argument. That's only if you're sloppy and careless and thoroughly biased. But understand these two important facts here. This theory of apostates and pagans contradicts their previous ones. And the context of the verses in Zechariah shows that the 70 years were in the past, not still ongoing and not just finishing either. We read, "So the angel of Jehovah answered and said, O Jehovah of armies, how long will you yourself not show mercy to Jerusalem and to the cities of Judah, whom you have denounced these 70 years? Zechariah 1:12. And also we read, "Say to all the people of the land and to the priests, when you fasted and there was a wailing in the 5th month and in the 7th month, and this for 70 years, did you really fast to me, even me?" Zechariah 7:5. Okay, now here's the point again, just to reiterate and make clear. When you look at this chart, the first thing you may notice about such a theory is that it totally and utterly contradicts the apostate's first theory that has been discussed. The idea of theirs that the desolation began in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, or 605 BC, with the fictitious exile they claim happened in that year. Surely you would think that apostates are sharply divided about what, quote, actually happened. That because of this, there is some disagreement among some apostates or anti-witnesses regarding this. You would be wrong. The same people use both arguments at the same time, laughably and illogically, while fully aware that both theories contradict each other. Therefore, they are, in fact, contradicting themselves. The apostates here are actually contradicting themselves when they use both arguments at the same time to try to somehow prove the same notion, showing that they have no credibility, keep their own arguments and assertions straight, and use both contradictory theories in their attempt to back up their claim. The reason is that they have one goal: to attack the Watchtower Society and Jehovah's Witnesses. Period. They couldn't care less about certain important facts and issues, and they couldn't care less how the 70-year prophecy was or was not fulfilled. They don't care about any pursuit of truth, although they may put on a false piety of supposedly searching for, quote, truth, or supposedly finding how the Watchtower was wrong. Supposedly finding how the Watchtower was wrong on this, or they've been just duped by the confusing satanic nonsense and are just now deceived deceivers, all to try to discredit the biblical 607 BC date for Jerusalem's actual destruction. The only important thing is that the Watchtower is, quote, proved wrong and little else matters. That is why they openly contradict themselves. Those words of Zechariah were said between 520 and 518 BCE, almost 70 years after Jerusalem was destroyed in secular timeline. Hence, apostates can claim that 587 was the true date of Jerusalem's destruction, and that those 70 years after Jerusalem was destroyed in the secular timeline, according to their view of 587 BCE, Apostates can claim that 587 was the true date of Jerusalem's destruction and that the foretold 70 years was still continuing according to those verses above, or maybe had just completed or something to that effect, but the basic notion that it was still ongoing when Zechariah wrote those words around 518. However, apostates and pagans of Christendom and atheists often take scriptures out of context, and this is no exception, twisting the prophetic word, sadly to their own destruction. And here's the logical proof. Here are the facts. At the start of the book of Zechariah, Jehovah warns the repatriated people not to become like their evicted ancestors who refused to listen and were punished. In other words, don't copy the Jews from 70 years before, because the same thing will happen to you if you go their path again. They do in fact need to show zeal for Jehovah and his worship and his purpose and complete the rebuilding of the temple. Next, Zechariah has a vision where men on horses walk around on the earth. Okay, so they report back saying, "We have walked about on the earth, and look, the whole earth is sitting still and having no disturbance." That's verse 11 of chapter 1. Yes, the nations are currently quiet. They are not concerned about the rebuilding of Jehovah's temple, mainly because it isn't happening. The Jews are being lazy and neglecting the work. There is a fear they may become just like their forefathers. That is when the angel of Jehovah asks God, saying, "O Jehovah of armies, how long will you yourself not show mercy to Jerusalem and to the cities of Judah, whom you have denounced these 70 years?" That's verse 12. Stop and think about this statement. The angel knew that it was 70 years long. All of God's servants, human and spirit, knew that, since it was made crystal clear through a number of God's inspired Hebrew prophets. Doesn't it seem odd that the angel would ask Jehovah, quote, "how long," when the exact length of time had already been determined, namely 70 years? The only reason to ask such a rhetorical question is because the 70 years had already ended in the past and was not still ongoing, as apostates have claimed. Yet by all appearances, Jerusalem was still in a partially desolated and ruined place in desperate need of rebuilding. Indeed, the temple was still not completed. In other words, it was like as if the angel was asking, quote, "Were the 70 years of desolation not enough, Lord?" In other words, will Jehovah continue withholding his favor just as he did during the 70 years of desolation? Indeed, O Jehovah, how long? Jehovah himself answers the angel's question. He says, "I have been jealous for Jerusalem and for Zion with great jealousy. With great indignation I am feeling indignant against the nations that are at ease. My own house will be built in her. My cities will yet overflow with goodness." Verses 14 to 17. Yes, according to this, the Most High will show favor. Jerusalem and the temple will be rebuilt, and blessings will flow to God's people. He says, "I have been zealous, I have been jealous for Jerusalem and for Zion." Now let's take a wider look at the verse in Zechariah chapter 7. Let's be careful and honest here. Throughout the 70 years of desolation, and since the repatriation of the Hebrew Israelites to their homeland, the Jews have kept festivals of fasting, commemorating their sorrow over the destruction of Jerusalem, for their sin and idolatry. Okay. One day, men from the city of Bethel come to the prophet Zechariah, and a rep of theirs asks, "Shall we, the people of Bethel, keep in the 5th month practicing an abstinence the way I have done these, oh, how many years?" Chapter 7, verse 3. Notice that they do not specify that it was 70 years only, because the commemoration had continued on now for an additional 17 years. The answer then comes from Jehovah God in verses 5 to 7. The Almighty says to his prophet Zechariah, "When you fasted and there was a wailing in the 5th month and in the 7th month, and this for 70 years, did you really fast to me, even me? And when you would eat and when you would drink, were not you the ones doing the eating? And were not you the ones doing the drinking? Clearly, Jehovah God here is talking of the past, quote, when they fasted during the, quote, 70 years. The 70 years were not continuing at that point, although their fasting in the same manner had continued just the same. That's where some people trip themselves up and can't see clearly and get careless and sloppy. Being sloppy and biased is the whiny apostate's habit, of course, we know. But let's check this out, okay? The Lord continues, should you not obey the words that Jehovah has spoken out through the former prophets while Jerusalem happened to be inhabited and at ease with her cities all around her? That's verse 7 of chapter 7. Jehovah's words are merely pointing out how much better obedience in the first place would have been than the later fasting over the calamity. If they had never committed gross sin and disobedience to begin with, they would not even be in this situation and would not have to even deal with all this fasting and sorrow and repentance, etc. Notice that God's words actually take them back in time and remind them that if they had simply been obedient when the land was still inhabited before the calamity, then the 70 years of desolation would not have occurred. There would not have been a destruction and punishment and so forth. If the fastings and commemorations were really for Jehovah, rather than for their own sorrow and their own pain, they would be obedient. The rest of the chapter reminds them of just why the desolation came upon them. When we look at the context and are careful, thorough, and honest and logical with the previous information that we discussed, that the land was to be desolated, uninhabited, ruined, and a wilderness for 70 years, we can see that the 70-year desolation was not continuing at that point when Zechariah wrote his book. It ended when the Jews were repatriated in 537 BCE and began when Jerusalem was destroyed 70 years earlier in 607 BCE. Now remember these 2 points again whenever an apostate or pagan or atheist brings up Zechariah as somehow proving the 70 years were continuing and therefore the destruction of Jerusalem had to have occurred at 587 rather than 607. Okay, this theory of apostates and pagans contradicts their previous ones. They contradict themselves at the same time and don't care. And also that the context of the verses in Zechariah and careful reading and analysis show that the 70 years were in the past and not still ongoing and not just finishing either or whatever. So appealing to Zechariah does not help the 587 year people for Jerusalem's destruction, or the apostate whiners, or the confused and deceived ones. They think it does, but I just proved, not just asserted, but proved, logically and with facts and with points, that it actually doesn't. And ironically, when you are more careful in your examination of this, it actually does the opposite and disproves their notion.